Marion, Ohio, 1993. A small Midwestern city where everyone knew everyone, where the social fabric was tight enough that scandal traveled faster than the evening news. Diane Caldwell was 24 years old, newly married to a man named Richard Caldwell, charming, well-spoken, a local insurance adjuster with a reputation for being the kind of neighbor who remembered your birthday. By every external measure, they looked like the ideal couple. But people close to Diane noticed something over the years. She second-guessed herself constantly. She would start a sentence and then abandon it, as if she'd lost confidence mid-thought. She apologized for things that weren't her fault. Friends described her as someone who had faded from the person she used to be. Living in the same neighborhood was a woman named Carol Prentice, 41, a single mother, a childhood friend of Richard's who had re-entered their social circle after moving back to town. By multiple accounts, Carol and Richard had a complicated history. And by the fall of 1993, that history was about to become lethal. On October 14, 1993, Carol Prentice was reported missing. Her car was found parked 2 blocks from her home. Her back door was unlocked. A half-eaten meal was still on the kitchen table. The investigation went nowhere. After 18 months, the case went cold. Officially, Carol Prentice was a missing person. Unofficially, local detectives suspected foul play but had nothing to build on. No body, no witnesses, no physical evidence. What they didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that there had been a witness. And she was living in a house she shared with the man she suspected had done it. Here is what Diane Caldwell would eventually tell investigators, 30 years after the fact. On the night of October 13, 1993, she had come home earlier than expected. She had walked in on an argument between Richard and Carol Prentice in their kitchen, a screaming, physical confrontation. She had seen Richard's hands on Carol's throat. She had seen Carol go limp. She had stood in the doorway for what she later described as a forever kind of moment. And then Richard had turned and looked at her. He said 4 words. "You didn't see that." Over the days that followed, something systematic began. Richard told her she had been drinking. She hadn't been, but he repeated it until she wasn't sure. He told her she had a history of episodes, moments of confusion she couldn't trust. He began citing past arguments she didn't remember having, conversations that felt slightly wrong, but that she couldn't definitively deny. He started gently, then consistently, then relentlessly planting the idea that her memory was unreliable. Within 2 weeks of Carol Prentice going missing, Diane Caldwell had begun to genuinely doubt what she had seen, not because the memory was gone, but because every time it surfaced, it arrived wrapped in layers of shame, confusion, and self-doubt that Richard had carefully installed around it. Carol's body was never found in 1993. It would take 30 years, a construction project, and a forensic anthropologist to change that. In 2022, workers excavating land for a commercial development approximately 4 miles outside of Marion uncovered skeletal remains. Forensic analysis identified them as Carol Prentice. The cause of death, manual strangulation. The case was reopened. The detective assigned to the reopened case was a 20-year veteran named Sergeant Lisa Hartwell. She had never worked the original investigation, which turned out to be an advantage. She came to the file without assumptions. Hartwell's first observation was about Diane Caldwell. Diane was now 54 years old and had been divorced from Richard for 11 years. Something in her interview manner struck Hartwell immediately, the way Diane would approach certain topics and then pull back, as if touching a bruise. She described this to a colleague as someone who had been trained not to trust herself. Hartwell brought in Dr. Michelle Acaffer, a forensic psychologist specializing in trauma and coercive control. Dr. Acaffer's job wasn't to tell investigators what Diane remembered. Her job was to assess whether Diane's memory had been deliberately tampered with. Over 6 sessions, a pattern emerged. Diane's authentic recollections had specific sensory detail: the smell of the kitchen, the color of Carol's jacket, the sound the chair made when it scraped the floor. False or implanted memories, according to established research, tend to lack this granularity. They're more like summaries than scenes. What Diane had suppressed was not a summary. It was a scene with texture. Dr. Acaffer diagnosed what she formally documented as sustained psychological manipulation consistent with coercive control, a deliberate, long-term effort to undermine Diane's cognitive confidence in specific memories. Simultaneously, financial investigators began examining Richard Caldwell's records from 1993. Carol Prentice had named him as the beneficiary on a small life insurance policy, a fact that had been overlooked in the original investigation. That policy paid out in 1995 after Carol was legally declared dead. And then came the confession, not from Richard. From Richard's younger brother, David, now 61, terminally ill with lung cancer and apparently intent on dying without carrying the secret. David Caldwell told investigators that on the morning of October 14, 1993, Richard had called him at 4 a.m. and asked for help moving something heavy. He told them where the body had been buried. The location matched exactly where the remains had been found in 2022. What Richard Caldwell did to Diane is not unique. It has a name, it has research behind it, and it is far more common than most people realize. The term gaslighting comes from a 1944 film, but the psychological mechanism is ancient, the deliberate and sustained manipulation of another person's perception of reality in order to make them doubt their own mind. In criminal contexts, it is increasingly recognized as a tool of coercive control, and courts in several jurisdictions now treat it as a form of psychological abuse. What made Richard's campaign particularly sophisticated was its targeting. He didn't try to make Diane forget everything. He targeted one specific memory with surgical precision, layering doubt, false context, and manufactured history, specifically around the event of October 13, 1993. Dr. Acaffer testified that this kind of targeted suppression is actually evidence of deliberate intent. A random mental illness doesn't selectively erase one evening. Only a person with something specific to hide works that specifically. Research by cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, whose decades of work on memory malleability has transformed how courts evaluate eyewitness testimony, shows that memories are not recordings. They are reconstructions, and they are vulnerable to post-event suggestion. What Richard exploited, knowingly or by instinct, was exactly this vulnerability. But here's what the research also shows. While memories can be distorted around the edges, highly emotionally charged, sensory-specific memories are among the most resistant to complete erasure. The brain marks trauma differently. The memory Diane carried for 30 years, fragmented, doubted, flinched away from, had survived precisely because it was so visceral. The gaslighter's paradox. The very technique meant to destroy the memory made it more durable. He wrapped it so carefully in doubt that it was preserved in amber. Richard Caldwell was arrested in March 2023. He was 67 years old. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Carol Prentice, criminal concealment of a homicide, and insurance fraud. His trial began in January 2024. The prosecution's central exhibit was not physical evidence, though the forensic pathology was compelling. The prosecution's central exhibit was Diane Caldwell herself. She testified for 2 days. Her testimony, backed by Dr. Acaffer's expert analysis, walked the jury through what 3 decades of psychological manipulation looks like from the inside. She described the slow erosion of her own confidence, the years she had spent in therapy trying to understand why she felt such persistent, sourceless dread. The moment in 2022, watching a news segment about the found remains, when everything had surfaced like an object rising through water. Richard Caldwell was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. His brother David died of lung cancer 4 months before the trial concluded. His deathbed statement was admitted as evidence. As for Diane, she has spoken publicly about her experience once, in a brief statement outside the courthouse. She said, "I didn't remember wrong. I remembered exactly right. I just wasn't allowed to believe it." This case has since been cited in legal scholarship on coercive control and in discussions about reforming how courts treat psychological manipulation evidence. Several advocacy groups have used it as a foundation for arguing that sustained gaslighting, documented and proven, should carry its own criminal charge separate from the underlying crime. Carol Prentice was 50 years old when she died. She had a daughter named Sarah who was 9 at the time. Sarah was 40 years old when she finally learned what had happened to her mother. Justice, in this case, arrived 30 years late, but it arrived. CTA, 30 seconds. If this case stayed with you, it should, because what Richard Caldwell did wasn't just murder. It was the systematic destruction of another person's ability to trust their own mind. And cases like this are more common than the headlines show. If you want to go deeper into the psychology behind crimes like these cold cases where the weapon was invisible, where the real evidence was buried in human behavior, subscribe. We cover exactly these cases, the ones where truth took decades to surface. Hit subscribe and make sure you never miss one. Outro, 30-45 seconds. Here is the question that lingers after a case like this. If Diane had never doubted herself, if she had walked straight to a police station in October of 1993, Carol Prentice might have had justice within a year. Her daughter might have known the truth before she turned 10 instead of 40. But Diane wasn't weak. She wasn't confused by accident. She was methodically, deliberately made to doubt her own memory by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The lesson isn't that memory is fragile. The lesson is that some people know exactly how to use that fragility as a weapon. And the only thing that ultimately defeated it was time, a dying man's conscience, and one woman who never fully stopped believing that what she had seen was real. Sleep well tonight. SEOTAGS. True crime, cold case, criminal psychology, gaslighting, false memories, coercive control, unsolved murder, forensic investigation, psychological manipulation, murder documentary, cold case solved, eyewitness testimony, memory psychology, true crime documentary, criminal behavior description. For 30 years, the only witness to a murder was convinced she had imagined it, not because she was lying, but because someone had spent decades making her doubt her own mind. In this episode of Crime Dossier, we investigate how a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation kept a killer free for 3 decades, and how forensic psychology finally cracked a case that physical evidence alone couldn't solve. Featuring real research on false memory, coercive control, and eyewitness testimony, this case exposes how gaslighting can be used as a literal murder weapon, and how truth, buried deep enough, still finds a way to the surface. A story about criminal psychology, cold case investigation, and the terrifying malleability of human memory. Subscribe for more true crime deep dives every week.